The air at the Miller family reunion always hummed with a specific frequency, a blend of sizzling barbecue, Uncle Robert's booming laughter, and the delicate, yet persistent, buzz of passive aggression. It was a symphony I had learned to conduct from a young age, mastering the art of smiling placidly while my insides churned with unspoken retorts. This year, however, felt different. I wasn't just deflecting questions about my non-existent love life or my refusal to leave our small town of Oakhaven. I was carrying a fragile, budding dream, and I knew this environment was the equivalent of a frost-covered greenhouse. I stood by the sprawling oak tree that gave our ancestral home its name, a glass of lukewarm lemonade sweating in my hand. My cousin Mark was holding court by the pool, recounting a recent triumph at his father's investment firm. He gesticulated wildly, his new watch, a graduation gift worth more than my car, flashing in the oppressive July sun. His audience, a collection of aunts, uncles, and younger cousins, hung on every word, their faces a mixture of admiration and envy. They were a flock of crows, drawn to the shiniest object. My mother found me in the shade. "There you are, Alara, hiding away." Her smile was gentle, but her eyes were laced with the familiar anxiety she reserved for these gatherings. "Just enjoying the breeze, Mom," I lied, forcing a smile back. "It's hot out here." "Your Uncle Robert was asking about you," she said, her voice dropping a decibel. "He wants to know what you're planning to do now that you're done with that botany course." The botany course was a 2-year intensive program in herbalism and natural product creation that I had poured my heart and savings into. To my family, it was a quaint, whimsical detour from a real career. To me, it was the foundation of everything. "I'll tell him," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. The dream I was nursing was called Hearth and Hedge. It was more than a business. It was an extension of my soul. I envisioned a small, curated line of artisanal goods, hand-poured candles scented with botanicals foraged from the local woods, small-batch herbal remedies based on my grandmother's old recipes, infused honeys, and soaps that smelled of rain-soaked earth and wildflowers. Each product would be tied to the folklore and history of the Oakhaven Valley, a story in every jar and every flicker of a flame. It was small, it was personal, and it was everything to me. I had a business plan, a tiny workshop set up in my small rented cottage, and a fire in my belly that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Later, as dusk began to settle and the fireflies started their hesitant blinking dance, we all gathered around the long, groaning picnic tables for dinner. The air was thick with the scent of grilled meat and citronella. This was it, the tribunal. Uncle Robert, his face ruddy from a combination of sun and expensive whiskey, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and fixed his gaze on me. He sat at the head of the table, a self-appointed king on a rickety wooden throne. "So, Ellie," he boomed, the nickname a deliberate jab at my age. I was 26. "Your mother tells me you're done playing with plants. Time to get a real job, eh? Mark's got an entry-level opening at the firm. Good benefits. 401k, you could do worse." Every head turned towards me. The conversation lulled, the clinking of cutlery softening. It was the moment I had been dreading. My father shifted uncomfortably beside me, his loyalty torn between his brother and his daughter. I took a deep breath, the scent of pine and damp earth from the nearby woods steadying me. "Actually, Uncle Robert, I'm starting my own business." A ripple of surprised murmurs went through the table. My Aunt Carol, Robert's wife, raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, how ambitious," she said, her tone suggesting the exact opposite. "Let the girls speak, Carol," Robert said, leaning forward with a smirk. "Let's hear it. What are you selling? Stocks, bonds, real estate?" "Herbal remedies," I said, my voice clear and steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Hand-poured candles, artisanal soaps, things like that. It's called Hearth and Hedge." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. It was broken, inevitably, by Uncle Robert's explosive laugh. It wasn't a kind laugh. It was a dismissive, patronizing roar that echoed across the lawn. Mark joined in, a snide, high-pitched chuckle that grated on my nerves. "Hearth and Hedge," Robert sputtered, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. "Good God, Ellie, are you going to sell it at the farmer's market next to the lady with the knitted goat hats?" "It's a cottage business, darling," Aunt Carol cooed to the woman next to her, loud enough for me to hear. How sweet. The word cottage was deployed like a weapon, designed to shrink my ambition into a hobby, a little pastime for an unmarried girl with no real prospects. It was meant to box me in, to put my dream on a shelf alongside dollhouses and scrapbooks. "So let me get this straight," Mark chimed in, leaning across the table with a look of mock seriousness. "You're going to sell fancy weeds and scented wax. Who's your target market?" "Gnomes." More laughter. I felt my face flush, a hot, creeping tide of shame and anger. I looked at my parents. My mother was staring intently at her plate of potato salad, her lips pressed into a thin, unhappy line. My father had his jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He wanted to defend me, but he had spent a lifetime in his older brother's shadow. He wouldn't. I opened my mouth to retaliate. I wanted to tell them about my market research, my carefully crafted brand story, the unique sourcing of my ingredients, the e-commerce platform I was building, the hours I had spent perfecting my formulas until my hands were stained with herbs and my cottage smelled like a forest floor. I wanted to scream that a business's worth wasn't measured by the size of its office building or the number on a 401k statement. But then I looked at their faces, the smug certainty on Robert's, the pity on Carol, the derisive grin on Mark's, and I saw the futility of it. They weren't interested in understanding. They were interested in reinforcing their own narrow definition of success. My words would be nothing more than pebbles thrown against a fortress. They would bounce off, unheard, and I would be left feeling even smaller. So I closed my mouth. I did the one thing they didn't expect. I stayed silent. I met my Uncle Robert's gaze, held it for a beat, and then gave a small, unreadable smile. I picked up my fork and took a bite of coleslaw, chewing slowly and deliberately as if he had just commented on the weather. My silence was a vacuum. It confused them. They had expected tears or a flustered, passionate defense they could easily dismantle. They had armed themselves for a fight, and I had refused to show up. Their laughter faltered, dying out into awkward coughs. The conversation stumbled before someone mercifully changed the subject to the local football team's chances this season. For the rest of the evening, I was a ghost at the feast. I answered direct questions with polite, brief responses. I helped clear the tables. I played with my younger cousins, pushing them on the tire swing, their innocent laughter a soothing balm on my wounded pride. But inside, a quiet, cold fury was solidifying. Their mockery, their dismissal, their condescending laughter, it all became fuel. Every snide remark was another log on the fire. Later, I sat on the porch swing, the same one my grandfather had built, the chains creaking a familiar lullaby. The party was winding down, the sound of car doors and shouted goodbyes drifting from the driveway. My mother came and sat beside me, her weight making the swing dip. "I'm sorry about your uncle," she said softly, not looking at me. He doesn't understand things he can't put a price tag on." "It's okay, Mom," I said, my voice hollow. "Is it?" she asked, finally turning to me, her eyes shimmering in the dim porch light. "Ilara, your father and we just want you to be secure. This path you're choosing, it's not an easy one." "The easy path isn't always the right one," I whispered, looking out at the dark silhouette of the woods that bordered the property. My woods, the source of my inspiration, my ingredients, my strength. They thought my silence was weakness. They saw it as surrender. They didn't understand. It wasn't surrender, it was a vow. I wouldn't waste my breath trying to convince them of my worth. I would not beg for their approval or validation. Instead, I would pour every ounce of my being, every drop of my frustration and hurt, into hearth and hedge. I would build my business with my own two hands, brick by silent brick. And one day, my success would be the only argument I ever needed to make. It would not be a shout, but a roar. And it would be deafening. As I sat there, cloaked in the quiet of the night, I let the hurt crystallize into a diamond-hard resolve in the center of my chest. Let them laugh. Let them mock. Let them call it a cottage business. They had no idea the empire I was about to build from that cottage, one candle, one remedy, one story at a time. The silence was my shield, but my work would be my sword. The weeks following the reunion were a blur of deliberate, focused labor. The echoes of my family's laughter became the metronome to which I worked. Their scorn was a strange, bitter nectar. It hurt, but it also nourished a ferocious, unyielding part of me I hadn't known existed. I retreated to my cottage, a small stone and timber structure nestled at the edge of the woods, and turned it into a fortress of creation. This wasn't just my home. It was the heart of hearth and hedge, and I was its devoted, solitary keeper. My workshop, a converted sunroom at the back of the cottage, was my sanctuary. Morning light streamed through the paned glass, illuminating a scene of organized chaos. Bunches of lavender, yarrow, and chamomile hung from the wooden beams, their scents intermingling to create a perfume of earth and calm. My workbench, a sturdy oak table I'd salvaged and refinished myself, was a landscape of alchemy. On any given day, you would find beeswax melting in a double boiler, its golden aroma filling the air, glass beakers filled with deep green infusions of comfrey and calendula oil, and mortars and pestles holding crushed resins and herbs. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with amber glass bottles, tins, and jars, all waiting to be filled. This room was the complete antithesis of my uncle's world of spreadsheets and stock tickers. Here, value was measured in patience, in the slow unfurling of a leaf, in the precise temperature of wax. My days began before dawn. I'd pull on my worn boots, grab my woven basket, and slip into the woods while the mist still clung to the ferns. I learned the forest's secrets, where the wild mint grew thickest by the creek, which pines wept the most fragrant resin, the exact time of summer when the St. John's wort flowers were at their most potent. These were my raw materials, not just ingredients, but characters in the stories I was trying to tell. This connection to the land was the soul of my brand, the authenticity I knew could not be manufactured or faked. The nights were for a different kind of work. Fueled by endless cups of herbal tea, I transformed into a web developer, a graphic designer, a photographer, and a social media manager. I taught myself how to build a simple, elegant e-commerce website. I spent hours designing labels, agonizing over fonts and layouts that would convey the magic I felt when creating the products. I set up an Instagram account, at Hearth and Hedge, and began to populate it not with sterile product shots, but with moments. A photo of my muddy hands holding a freshly dug root, a short video of steam rising from a simmering pot of herbs, a close-up of a candle flame dancing in the dark, its light catching the crystalline structure of the wax. I wrote long captions, sharing the folklore behind a certain plant or the personal memory that inspired a scent. I wasn't just selling a product, I was inviting people into my world. To make ends meet, I kept my part-time job at the town library 3 days a week. The quiet, book-scented aisles were a respite, but the paycheck was a harsh reminder of my reality. My savings were dwindling at an alarming rate. The initial costs of glassware, organic carrier oils, and shipping materials were a constant, heavy weight on my mind. There were nights I'd lie awake, my uncle's voice slithering into my thoughts. A real job, good benefits, 401k. Doubt was a cold, creeping vine, and I had to fight constantly to cut it back. My first real test was the Oak Haven Fall Festival. It was a step up from the weekly farmers market, a town-wide event that drew crowds from neighboring counties. Taking Uncle Robert's jibe and turning it into a goal, I booked a stall. The fee took a significant bite out of my remaining funds. For 2 weeks straight, I worked like a woman possessed, producing inventory until my hands were raw and my back ached. I packed up my little car the night before, my heart a frantic hummingbird in my chest. The day of the festival was crisp and bright, the autumn air filled with the scent of fallen leaves and spiced cider. My stall was small, tucked between a boisterous jam maker and a potter with a booming voice. I arranged my wares on rustic wooden crates, with sprigs of dried herbs and small, handwritten cards explaining each product's story. For the first hour, people streamed past, their eyes skimming over my humble display before moving on to flashier stalls. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. Had they been right? Was this all a foolish, fanciful dream? Then an elderly woman with kind, crinkled eyes and a long silver braid stopped. She moved slowly, picking up a tin of my woodsman's salve, a deep healing balm of comfrey, pine resin, and cedar. She unscrewed the lid and inhaled deeply. My grandmother used to make something that smelled just like this, she said, her voice soft and raspy. "For my grandfather's hands after he'd been chopping wood. It's the pine. Nobody gets the pine right anymore." She looked up at me, a genuine, warm smile spreading across her face. "I'll take 2 of these, and what is this?" "Dream Weaver's tea." We talked for 20 minutes. She told me stories of her own grandmother's remedies, and I told her about my process. Her name was Mrs. Gable, and her validation felt more valuable than a chest of gold. She bought a salve, the tea, and a large hearthside candle scented with cinnamon, clove, and orange. After she left, the energy of my stall seemed to shift. It was as if her belief had created a small, warm pocket of light. Others started to stop. A young hiker bought the woodsman's salve for his blisters. A stressed-looking mother bought the Dream Weaver's tea and a lavender-scented peaceful slumber candle. A group of teenage girls giggled over the enchanted forest soap, which was layered with activated charcoal and smelled of petrichor. By the end of the day, I had sold nearly 3/4 of my inventory. My cash box was full, but more importantly, my spirit was overflowing. I had connected with people. They hadn't just bought a product, they had bought a piece of my story. That small success was the ember I needed to keep the fire going. My Instagram started to gain traction. People who had bought things at the festival tagged my account, posting pictures of my candles burning in their homes. I engaged with every comment, answered every question. I started a weekly Folklore Friday post delving into the history of a specific plant. This wasn't a faceless brand. It was a community, a small but growing collection of people who appreciated the slow, the handmade, the story-driven. The online orders began to trickle in, at first just 1 or 2 a week. I would package each one as if it were a precious gift, writing a personal, handwritten thank you note and tucking in a small, complimentary sample of a tea or a wax melt. I knew I couldn't compete with big companies on price or speed, but I could win on personal connection and care. One evening in late November, I was fulfilling an order from a small boutique in Asheville, North Carolina, a place I'd never been. They had found my Instagram and ordered a small wholesale batch to test in their shop. It was my biggest order to date. As I carefully wrapped a bar of soap in its waxed paper sleeve, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. She had attached a photo. It was a screenshot from my Aunt Carol's Facebook page. In the photo, a hearth and hedge, hearthside candle was burning on her perfectly polished mantelpiece. The caption read, "Enjoying this lovely little candle, so festive." I stared at the picture, a complex cocktail of emotions swirling inside me. There was no mention of me, no tag for my business. It was presented as a quaint, anonymous discovery. It was a backhanded compliment, a way of acknowledging my product while still denying my legitimacy as a business owner. The old Alara would have been hurt, stung by the faint praise and the lack of credit. But as I looked around my workshop, at the cooling racks full of soap, the shelf of shipping boxes ready to go, the gentle flicker of a candle I was testing, I didn't feel hurt. I felt a strange, quiet sense of power. She had bought my product, whether out of pity, curiosity, or even genuine enjoyment didn't matter. She had paid for it. The transaction was complete. I was no longer just her niece with a silly hobby. I was a business owner, and she was, however begrudgingly, a customer. I put my phone down and went back to packing the Asheville order. The voices of mockery were still there, but they were fading, like a distant radio station losing its signal. They were being replaced by the steady, satisfying sound of my own work, the crinkle of packing paper, the snip of twine, and the quiet, confident hum of a dream taking flight. The new year arrived, dusting the Oak Haven woods with a layer of pristine, sound-dampening snow. Inside my cottage, however, things were far from quiet. The wholesale order from the Asheville boutique had sold out in less than 2 weeks. The owner, a woman named Dahlia with a voice like wind chimes, had called me, gushing with a kind of enthusiasm I had only ever felt myself. "Ilara, I've never seen anything like it," she'd said. "People are coming in and asking for your products by name. They love the stories on the labels. We need more, double the last order. And can we talk about a spring collection?" That phone call was a turning point. It was the first time someone in the retail world, a stranger with no obligation to be kind, had looked at Hearth and Hedge and seen not a cute hobby, but a marketable, desirable brand. I spent January in a frenzy of production, sourcing new botanicals for spring scents, lilac, rain-kissed moss, wild violet, and carefully managing my finances to invest in more materials. My days were a cycle of melting, mixing, pouring, and packing, my nights spent updating my website and planning for the future. The business was growing, steadily and manageably. I felt a sense of control, a quiet pride in the sustainable rhythm I had built. Then came the second Tuesday in February, the day the world tilted on its axis. I was at the library, shelving books in the history section, when my phone, which I always kept on silent in my apron pocket, began to vibrate uncontrollably. It buzzed against my leg with such frantic energy I thought it was malfunctioning. I pulled it out and saw a cascade of notifications flooding the screen, faster than I could read them. Instagram mentions, website sale alerts, new follower notifications, hundreds of them. My heart leaped into my throat. My first thought was that my site had been hacked. I rushed to a quiet corner behind a shelf of oversized atlases and opened Instagram. My follower count, which had been sitting at a respectable 2,000, was climbing by the second. 2,500, 3,000, 5,000. Under the notifications tab, I saw the source. My brand had been mentioned, tagged, and raved about by Seraphina Moon. Seraphina Moon was a titan in the world I aspired to inhabit. She was a blogger and influencer who championed a lifestyle of slow living, sustainability, and authentic craftsmanship. She had nearly 1 million followers, but she was notoriously selective about what she featured. Her audience trusted her implicitly because she never did paid ads, only sharing things she genuinely discovered and loved. In a series of 10 Instagram stories, she had unboxed an order a friend had sent her as a gift. It was my Winter Woods collection. With trembling hands, I watched the stories. She filmed my packaging, praising the recycled materials and the hand-tied twine. She lit the first snow candle, her camera zooming in on the flame as she described the scent of balsam fir, cardamom, and cold, crisp air. "It smells like an actual memory," she whispered to her followers, her voice filled with genuine awe. She showed the woodsman's salve, rubbing a little on her hands and talking about the purity of the ingredients. "You can just feel that this was made by someone who understands plants, who has a connection to the earth," she said. "This isn't a company, this is a craft. This is magic. It's called Hearth and Hedge." The final slide was a link to my website. The aftermath was a tidal wave. My Shopify app chimed with a new sale every few seconds, a frantic, joyous, terrifying symphony. I mumbled an excuse to my manager at the library and ran home, my mind reeling. By the time I got to my cottage, my entire winter collection was sold out. By dinner time, my entire inventory, every last candle, soap, and salve, was gone. The website now featured a sea of gray, sold-out buttons. In less than 8 hours, I had made more money than I had in the previous 6 months combined. Then, inevitably, the sheer volume of traffic crashed my website. I sat on the floor of my workshop, the buzzing of my phone finally silent, and stared at the empty shelves. A strange combination of euphoria and panic washed over me. I had dreamed of this moment, of my work being seen and appreciated. But the dream had never included the logistical nightmare that was now my reality. My inbox was flooded with hundreds of emails. Some were from disappointed customers who couldn't place an order. Others were from people asking when products would be back in stock. And then there were the emails from other shops, dozens of them from all over the country, all asking for wholesale information. The next 2 weeks were the most grueling of my life. I barely slept. I lived off of toast and tea. The first challenge was communication. I put a banner on my repaired website, thanking everyone for their support and explaining that I was a one-woman operation and was working as fast as I could to restock. I wrote a heartfelt post on Instagram, telling my story and asking for patience. The response was overwhelmingly positive. My new followers loved that the brand was a real person. They championed the small business aspect, but their support didn't change the physical reality of the situation. I had a mountain of orders to fulfill and no product. My usual suppliers were cleared out. The woman from whom I bought my beeswax had enough for a dozen candles, not the 500 I needed. My source for organic essential oils had to special order my quantities. I spent days on the phone and online, vetting new suppliers, demanding samples, refusing to compromise on the ethical and quality standards that Serafina Moon had praised. This was the soul of my brand, and I would not sell it, no matter how intense the pressure became. The physical labor was immense. When the new supplies finally started arriving, my tiny cottage was overrun. Boxes of glass jars and tins filled my living room. Sacks of beeswax and shea butter crowded my hallway. I worked 18-hour days. My hands, stained with herbs and dotted with small burns from hot wax, ached constantly. My back felt permanently knotted. One night at 3 a.m., I was stirring a massive pot of salve base when I started to cry. They were tears of exhaustion, stress, and a profound, terrifying loneliness. I had achieved the success I'd craved, and it was threatening to break me. I couldn't do it all. The realization hit me not like a lightning bolt, but like the slow, crushing weight of a collapsing roof. My refusal to ask for help, my silent vow to do it all myself, had become a liability. It was no longer a shield, it was a cage. The next morning, bleary-eyed and desperate, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Mrs. Gable. I explained the situation, my voice cracking with exhaustion. She listened patiently, then said, "My dear, you are no longer tending a garden. You are managing a forest. You need forest rangers." The second call was to a local real estate agent. I used the money from the viral surge, a sum that still felt like a fantasy, as a down payment to lease a small commercial space in town. It was an old apothecary, long since closed, with beautiful wooden shelves and a large back room perfect for production. It was a terrifying, irreversible step. News travels fast in Oakhaven. That evening, my mother called. "Ilara, your Aunt Carol's friend sent her a link to that blogger Serafina something. Your candles are famous." Her voice was a mixture of pride and utter bewilderment. "Are you all right? It seems like a lot to handle." "I'm fine, Mom. It's busy, but it's good," I said, the practiced response automatic. "Well, your uncle was just saying, he said it's probably just a fad, a flash in the pan." There was a pause. "He doesn't get it, but we're proud of you, honey. We just worry." I hung up, a small, wry smile on my face. A fad, a flash in the pan. The words no longer carried a sting. They were the predictable grumblings of a man watching the world change in ways he couldn't comprehend. He could call it whatever he wanted. The next day I stood in front of the old apothecary, the key cold in my hand. The windows were dusty, the paint was peeling, but all I could see was potential. I saw a dedicated packing station, rows of professional-grade candle melters, and a small, beautiful storefront where the people of Oakhaven could come and smell the scents for themselves. This was the new heart of Hearth and Hedge. It was the terrifying, thrilling, necessary next step. As I unlocked the door, the click of the tumbler echoed in the quiet street. It was the sound of a cage opening. The sound of my cottage business finally, truly, outgrowing its cottage. Unlocking the door to the old Oakhaven apothecary for the first time as its tenant was like opening a time capsule. The air inside was thick with the ghostly scents of cinnamon, camphor, and old paper. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light slanting through the tall, grimy windows. The place was a beautiful ruin, with dark wood shelves climbing to the ceiling, a scuffed hexagonal tile floor, and a long marble-topped counter. It was perfect. It had history. It had a soul. The next month was a whirlwind of renovation, but not the kind that involves gutting and replacing. It was a restoration. My father, a carpenter by trade, showed up the first weekend with his toolbox and a quiet, proud smile. He spent days helping me sand and refinish the original floors and shelves, his silent, steady work a more profound apology for his reunion silence than any words could have been. My mother came with paint cans in soft, earthy tones, moss green, mushroom gray, and a warm, creamy white, and we spent hours painting side by side, talking more than we had in years. This physical act of building the new Hearth and Hedge headquarters became a healing process. It was no longer just my dream. It was becoming a family project. Even my cousin Mark's younger sister, Amy, who was in high school, came by to help me plant a fragrant herb garden in the window boxes. She shyly admitted she'd been following my Instagram for months and thought what I was doing was actually really cool. The biggest challenge wasn't physical, it was mental. I had to learn to let go. The business was now a living entity, too big for me to cradle in my own 2 hands. I needed a team. Terrified of choosing the wrong people, I put out a single job posting on my Instagram account and the local town bulletin board, seeking a detail-oriented, kind human to help with packing, shipping, and customer care for a growing botanical business. Must have a genuine love for nature and the smell of beeswax. The next day, a young woman named Chloe knocked on the apothecary door. I recognized her immediately as a frequent customer from my farmer's market days. She had bright, intelligent eyes and a calm, capable energy. In her hands, she held a resume and a small, perfect jar of wild blackberry jam. "I made this," she said with a nervous smile. "I figured a cover letter was too formal. I've been in love with Hearth and Hedge since you sold your first candle. I know your brand. I know your story. And I'm the most organized person you will ever meet." I hired her on the spot. Chloe was a revelation. She learned my intricate, gift-like packaging process in a single afternoon. She responded to customer emails with a warmth and empathy that perfectly mirrored my own. She organized my chaotic inventory system with spreadsheets and color-coded labels. Her presence freed me to focus on what I did best: creation and strategy. For production, I turned to Mrs. Gable. I offered her a full-time position, but she just laughed, her eyes crinkling. "My dear, my full-time job these days is convincing my cat to get off the good armchair. But," she said, her expression softening, "I will come twice a week. I will be your master of infusions. And I will teach young Chloe the old ways. It's important these things are passed down." She became the wise, grounding presence of the workshop. Her slow, deliberate methods a constant reminder of the patient craft at the heart of the business. With a team in place and the new space operational, Hearth and Hedge was reborn. We were able to ramp up production without sacrificing an ounce of quality. The sold-out signs on the website were replaced with beautiful images of fully stocked products. We were a well-oiled, albeit small, machine. The new, visible storefront in the middle of Main Street was something my family could no longer ignore or downplay. One Saturday, a familiar luxury sedan pulled up outside. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carol stepped out, dressed in their weekend country club attire. They peered through the front window before hesitantly coming inside. The scent of melting beeswax, lavender, and cedar washed over them. Chloe was at the front counter, beautifully wrapping an online order. Mrs. Gable was in the back, visible through the archway, inspecting a tray of dried calendula flowers. My parents happened to be there, dropping off a new display stand my dad had built. The scene was one of productive, peaceful industry. "Ilara," Aunt Carol said, her voice unusually subdued. She ran a manicured finger over the smooth marble countertop. "This is quite the setup." "It's a long way from the farmer's market, Ellie?" Uncle Robert added, his eyes scanning the professional shelving, the stacks of shipping boxes, the sheer volume of it all. The mockery was gone, replaced by a look of baffled calculation. He was trying to crunch the numbers in his head to fit this reality into his worldview. "You're incorporated, I assume, an LLC at least. You need to protect your personal assets. And what about your supply chain management? With this kind of volume, you can't just be picking weeds in the woods anymore." It was his way of engaging, of trying to reclaim some authority by offering unsolicited, corporate-level advice. It was clumsy, but it was a world away from the dismissive laughter at the reunion. He was treating me not as his whimsical niece, but as a peer, an entrepreneur. I simply smiled. "I've got it covered, Uncle Robert, but thank you for the advice." His visit, however, was a harbinger of a new kind of challenge. As Hearth and Hedge grew, it started appearing on the radar of much larger companies. One afternoon, I received an email with the subject line, "Collaboration opportunity with a global home fragrance leader." It was from Viridian Home, one of the biggest names in the industry. Their synthetic, mass-produced candles were in every big-box store and supermarket in the country. They wanted to fly me out, first class, to their headquarters in New York. They were proposing a Hearth and Hedge by Viridian Home collection. They flattered me, telling me I had captured a lightning-in-a-bottle authenticity that the market was craving. They wanted to take my scent profiles and my brand story and introduce them to a global audience. The numbers they presented in the attached proposal were staggering. It was more money than my father had earned in his entire life. It was enough to be well and truly secure. as my mother had always wished. I printed out the proposal and sat with it in the small office I'd made for myself at the back of the apothecary. The scent of a new, rainy meadow candle I was testing, a mix of clover, damp earth, and chamomile, drifted in from the workshop. I could hear Chloe on the phone with a customer, laughing as she sorted out a shipping issue. I could hear the gentle clink of Mrs. Gable's glass beakers. I read the fine print of the contract. Viridian would handle all production. They would use their own suppliers and fragrance oils to replicate my scents for mass production. I would be a creative consultant, my name and face used for marketing. They weren't buying my business. They were buying its soul. They wanted to peel the story and the authenticity off my products like a label and slap it onto their own soulless, factory-made vessels. They would take my magic, dilute it, and sell it under fluorescent lights. Uncle Robert would have called it the deal of a lifetime. He would have called me a fool for even hesitating. The old Alara, the one who craved validation and security, might have been tempted. But I wasn't that Alara anymore. I had built this, not just for security, but for purpose. I looked at the contract, a document promising a fortune in exchange for my integrity. Then I looked through the office door, at the warm, light-filled workshop, at the two wonderful women who now depended on this business, at the shelves lined with products made with real herbs from the Oak Haven woods. I knew my answer. It was the easiest decision I'd ever made. I picked up my phone, my hand steady, and dialed the number for the senior vice president of Viridian Home, a man whose name I could barely remember. I was ready to tell him, politely but firmly, exactly what he could do with his multi-million-dollar offer. "Thank you for the very generous offer, Mr. Davies," I said into the phone, my voice calm and even. I was sitting in my small office, the Viridian Home proposal lying flat on my desk. I had drawn a small, defiant sprig of lavender in the margin. "But I'm afraid I'll have to decline." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with incredulity. "Decline?" Richard Davies, the senior vice president of global acquisitions, finally sputtered. He sounded as if I had just told him the sky was plaid. "Miss Miller, perhaps you misunderstood the numbers on page 12. This is a life-changing opportunity for a small batch producer like yourself." "I understand the numbers perfectly," I replied, a cool confidence settling over me. "And you're right, it is a life-changing amount of money. But the opportunity you're offering would require me to change the very life of my business. Hearth and Hedge is what it is because of how it's made, not just what it's called. The value isn't in the name, it's in the process. It's in Mrs. Gable knowing exactly when the chamomile is ready to harvest. It's in the wild-foraged pine resin in our woodsman's salve. Your model, as successful as it is, would strip that soul away. So, respectfully, my answer is no." "You're making a monumental mistake," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This artisanal fad will pass. In a year, you'll be forgotten. We're offering you a golden parachute. I strongly suggest you reconsider." "I'm not looking for a parachute," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "I'm building a plane. Thank you for your time, Mr. Davies." I ended the call before he could respond, the decisive click of the phone feeling like a closing door on a world I wanted no part of. I walked out into the main workshop. Chloe and Mrs. Gable both looked up, their expressions anxious. They knew who I had been talking to. I had explained the offer to them that morning, feeling they had a right to know. "Well," Chloe asked, twisting a piece of twine around her fingers. "I told them no," I said. A wave of palpable relief washed through the room. Mrs. Gable, who had been sitting perfectly still, let out a long breath and broke into a wide, beaming smile. "Good girl," she said, her voice thick with pride. "A soul is not a thing to be sold." Chloe let out a whoop of joy and rushed over to give me a hug. "I was so scared you were going to take it," she confessed. "I love working here, Alara, not for a company but for Hearth and Hedge, for what we do here." In that moment, I knew I had made the right decision. I had their loyalty, their trust, and their shared passion. That was a currency no contract could ever hope to purchase. Instead of cashing out, I doubled down. I took a significant portion of the profits we had made and began to strategically reinvest in our own growth. I didn't want to get bigger in a way that diluted our brand. I wanted to get stronger. We bought new, larger wax melters that could handle bigger batches while maintaining precise temperature control. We invested in a semi-automated bottling machine for our herbal oils, a device that would save us hours of labor without compromising the integrity of the product inside. I hired 2 more people from Oakhaven, a retired gentleman named Sam who was a wizard with logistics and inventory, and my cousin's sister, Amy, who I brought on as a paid intern to manage our social media and help Chloe with customer service. The apothecary, once so cavernously empty, was now filled with the hum of quiet work and the warmth of a shared purpose. We weren't just a business, we were becoming one of the town's proudest new employers. Word of my rejection of the Viridian home offer began to ripple through the small, interconnected world of artisanal retail and indie brands. It became a piece of industry gossip. To most, I was a fool, but to a few, I was an anomaly, an object of curiosity. One of those few was a journalist named Alastair Finch. He wrote for Artisan and Oak, a prestigious quarterly magazine that was the Bible for the discerning, conscious consumer. It was a publication known for its long-form journalism and stunning photography, focusing on craftspeople who prioritized integrity over profit. His email appeared in my inbox on a rainy April morning. He said he'd heard a fascinating rumor about a small apothecary owner who had turned down a fortune, and he wanted to know if the story was true. He wanted to come to Oakhaven and hear it from me. I was terrified, but I said yes. Alastair Finch was a kind, observant man with gray-streaked hair and a well-worn tweed jacket. He didn't come with a flashy crew, just a single, quiet photographer named Lena. He spent 3 days in Oakhaven. I walked him through the entire process, from foraging for plantain in a damp meadow to watching Chloe carefully pack a box for shipment. He interviewed everyone, me, Mrs. Gable, Chloe, even Sam. He asked thoughtful, insightful questions, not about profit margins or marketing strategies, but about my philosophy, about why the scent of real beeswax mattered, about the folklore that inspired the brand. On the last day, as we sat on the creek bank behind my cottage, he finally asked the question I knew was coming. Why did you say no, Allura? To Viridian? Be honest. I looked at the clear, flowing water at the new spring ferns unfurling on the bank. When I was just starting, I said slowly. My family, they didn't get it. They laughed at me. They called it a silly little cottage business. And for a while, I think I was working just to prove them wrong, to show them I could be successful in their terms, big numbers, a big buyout. But somewhere along the way, that changed. I fell in love with the work itself, with the process, with my customers. I built something that was successful on my terms. Saying yes to Viridian would have been like admitting my family was right all along, that the only value in my cottage business was the money a big corporation could squeeze out of it. Saying no, that was for me. It was the final act of proving that the business itself, in its purest form, was the prize. 2 months later, the summer issue of Artisan and Oak came out. The cover was a stunning, light-filled photograph Lena had taken of my hands, holding a handful of freshly picked lavender blossoms. The headline, in elegant serif font, read, "The Authenticity Economy, How Allura Miller Built a Brand So Real It's Priceless." The article was a masterpiece. It was a 12-page spread that captured the very essence of hearth and hedge. It wasn't just a story about a business. It was a manifesto for a new way of doing business. It went viral in circles the Instagram influencer could never have reached. It was shared by CEOs of sustainable brands, by ethical investment bloggers, by designers, artists, and tastemakers. The response was immediate and overwhelming. High-end, exclusive spas and luxury boutique hotels from around the world started contacting us, wanting to carry our line. They didn't want to change a thing. They wanted the authenticity the article had described. Our orders surged again, but this time we were ready. We were strong. We had our systems in place. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID was a private number. "Am I speaking with Allura Miller?" A warm, professional female voice asked. "This is she," I said. "My name is Anya Sharma," the voice said. "I'm a senior partner at the Peregrine Group. I just read the most remarkable article about you in Artisan and Oak. I have to say, in 20 years of venture capital, I've never heard a story quite like yours. We don't invest in companies we want to change. We invest in founders we believe in. I was wondering if you might be open to a conversation about a real partnership. I froze, my hand tightening on the phone. I knew the Peregrine Group. They were legendary. They were the kingmakers for sustainable, ethical brands, known for providing capital and mentorship without compromising the founder's vision. This wasn't an offer to buy me out. This was an offer to build my dream bigger, better, and stronger than I could ever do alone. This wasn't the sound of a golden parachute being offered. This was the sound of a runway being cleared for takeoff. Anya Sharma was nothing like I expected. When she stepped out of the black town car that had driven her from the city, she wasn't wearing a sharp power suit. Instead, she was dressed in elegant, tailored linen trousers and a simple silk blouse, her manner more like a visiting art professor than a venture capitalist titan. She insisted on meeting at the apothecary, not some sterile conference room. "I want to see the heart of the operation," she'd said on the phone. She spent the first hour just walking through the space, observing. She touched the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, watched Chloe pack an order with practiced care, and listened with genuine interest as Mrs. Gable explained the delicate process of infusing calendula oil under the gentle heat of the sun. She asked me about the specific folklore behind the Whispering Woods candle and inhaled the scent of my Metolite soap with her eyes closed, a small, appreciative smile on her face. She understood. She didn't just see a product, she saw the poetry behind it. We spent the next 2 days in a marathon of meetings, poring over my financials, my growth projections, and my 5-year plan. It was less of an interrogation and more of a collaborative exploration. Anya and her team from the Peregrine Group didn't want to change my vision. They wanted to amplify it. They offered a $7 million investment in exchange for a 20% stake in Hearth and Hedge. The money was staggering, but it was the terms of the deal that took my breath away. The investment was a strategic tool, designed to build, not dismantle. $3 million was allocated to the design and construction of a new, state-of-the-art, sustainable production facility on the outskirts of Oakhaven, a building that would use solar power and reclaimed water. $2 million was for securing long-term contracts with ethical, organic farms to scale our ingredient sourcing without compromising quality. The rest was for hiring a core executive team, a CFO, an operations manager, that I would personally select, and for funding a careful, targeted international launch. When it was my turn, I came prepared. I had spent sleepless nights with lawyers and mentors, including a crusty but brilliant retired CEO Mrs. Gable had put me in touch with. I looked Anya in the eye across the polished surface of my office desk. "I have 3 conditions," I said, my voice steady. "First, I retain full and final creative control over all products and branding. Forever. Second, the headquarters and primary production of Hearth and Hedge will always remain here in Oakhaven. We are part of this community. Third," I took a breath, "this was the most important one. 5% of the company's net profits, in perpetuity, will be placed into a new charitable foundation dedicated to the conservation of the Oakhaven Valley and the surrounding woodlands." Anya Sharma didn't even blink. She broke into a wide, brilliant smile. "Of course," she said. "We wouldn't have it any other way. We're not investing in a candle company, Alara. We're investing in you and the world you're building." We signed the papers a week later. The news, when it was released through official channels, sent a shockwave through the business world. Artisan and Oak ran an exclusive follow-up. Forbes wrote a piece titled, "7 Million Reasons to Bet on Authenticity." The story of the little cottage business that had said no to a corporate giant and yes to a visionary partner was intoxicating. My inbox was a flood of interview requests and congratulations. And then it was July, time for the Miller family reunion. This year, I drove up to the old house in a new dark green hybrid SUV. It was the first major purchase I had made. It was safe, reliable, and practical, but its quiet, confident hum was a world away from the sputtering uncertainty of my old sedan. As I stepped out of the car, a hush fell over the relatives gathered by the pool. All eyes were on me. The atmosphere was thick with a strange new deference. Aunt Carol rushed over, her smile stretched a little too wide, and gave me an awkward, patting hug. "Ilara, darling, you look wonderful. We are all just so incredibly thrilled for you. I always knew you had a creative spark." I just smiled. "Thank you, Aunt Carol." My cousin Mark, who was standing stiffly by the barbecue, gave me a short, jerky nod, unable to meet my eyes. The swagger was gone, replaced by a sullen discomfort. For the first time in our lives, the golden boy was in someone else's shadow. My parents, on the other hand, were radiating a pure, uncomplicated joy. My mom's eyes were bright with tears, and my dad wrapped me in a bone-crushing hug, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, kiddo," into my hair. I spent most of the afternoon talking with my younger cousins, answering their genuine, excited questions about what it was like to be a CEO. The real moment, the one the entire day had been building towards, came as dusk began to fall. I was standing by the great oak tree, watching the fireflies begin to rise from the lawn, when Uncle Robert approached. He had a glass of whiskey in one hand, and he stared into it for a long moment before speaking. "Ellie," he started, then stopped and cleared his throat. "Ilara!" He looked up, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes besides blustering pride or dismissive humor. I saw a grudging, profound respect. "That deal you signed," he said, his voice low and gruff, "with Anya Sharma's group. I read the press release. Minority stake, full creative control, the foundation that was a damn smart deal. A shark's deal." He took a sip of his whiskey. "I wouldn't have thought, the whole market for this stuff you make. I misjudged it. I was wrong." There it was. It wasn't an apology for the laughter, for the mockery, for the hurt. He was probably incapable of that. But it was something more meaningful. It was a concession. An admission from a man who defined the world in terms of profits and losses that I had bested him in his own language. The old Ilara would have savored this moment, would have felt a surge of triumphant, vengeful glee. But standing there, bathed in the soft twilight, all I felt was a quiet sense of peace. The anger I had held onto for so long had burned away, leaving behind the clean, solid bedrock of my own self-worth. I no longer needed his apology, because his opinion no longer had any power over me. "Thank you, Uncle Robert," I said, my voice gentle. "It's an exciting time." I gave him a small nod and walked away, leaving him standing there by the tree. I wasn't running away or hiding this time. I was moving toward the warm glow of the patio, where my team, Chloe, Mrs. Gable, and Sam, who I had invited as my guests, were laughing with my parents. My real family, the one I had built. The multi-million-dollar offer had come in, but it wasn't the one from Viridian Home that had mattered. It was the one from Peregrine. The one that validated my integrity, not just my profitability. The laughter from that dinner table a year ago was now just a phantom echo, a ghost story whose power to frighten had long since vanished. I had stayed silent then, but my work had spoken for me. And its voice, it turned out, was a roar that was impossible to ignore. 2 years passed. 2 years of focused, exhilarating, and sometimes exhausting work. The $7 million investment wasn't a finish line, it was a starting pistol. But under Anya Sharma's mentorship, and with the strength of a team I trusted with my life, we didn't just grow, we blossomed. The new Hearth and Hedge campus, as the press called it, was now a reality. Built on a plot of reclaimed farmland just outside Oakhaven, it was less a factory and more a testament to our ethos. The building, designed with sweeping lines of reclaimed timber and glass, seemed to rise organically from the landscape. A living roof of native grasses insulated the production floor, solar panels shimmered in the sun, and the entire facility was surrounded not by asphalt, but by acres of newly planted botanical gardens that we used for both inspiration and ingredients. It was the largest employer in Oakhaven, and its creation had revitalized the town's economy, a fact that gave me a deeper satisfaction than any sales report. Our brand was now global. I would start my Tuesdays on a video call with our distribution partners in London and Tokyo, discussing product placement in luxury boutiques I could once only dream of walking past. Our Enchanted Forest soap was a cult favorite in Paris. Our Peaceful Slumber candle was a bestseller in the spas of 5-star hotels in Kyoto. It was surreal. Yet, I made sure that the soul of the business never strayed far from its source. After those international calls, I'd often pull on my old boots and spend the afternoon with Mrs. Gable in the woods behind my cottage, searching for the elusive lady slipper orchid or the perfect patch of wild ginger, our hands in the same rich soil that had started it all. The proudest achievement, however, had nothing to do with commerce. The Hearth and Hedge Foundation made its first major move, purchasing 300 acres of pristine, old-growth forest that had been slated for a luxury housing development. We named it the Oak Haven Preserve, and its trails were now open to the public forever. One crisp autumn afternoon, I stood at the trailhead and watched a local family laugh as they headed into the woods. That, I realized, was the true measure of my success. That was the empire I had wanted to build. For Thanksgiving that year, I hosted dinner at my home. I had bought and restored an old stone farmhouse not far from my original cottage, filling it with comfortable furniture, shelves of books, and the constant, gentle scent of whatever new blend I was experimenting with. My original cottage I kept as my private creative lab, a sacred space where the real magic still happened. Everyone was there. My parents, their faces etched with a permanent, peaceful pride, helped me in the kitchen. Chloe, Sam, and Mrs. Gable were there with their families, a boisterous, happy crowd. I had also invited Uncle Robert, Aunt Carol, and Cousin Mark. Their arrival was quiet, stripped of all the old, pompous energy. They brought a bottle of expensive wine, handing it to me with a deference that was still jarring. The evening was surreal. Aunt Carol asked my mother for my recipe for herb-roasted turkey. Cousin Mark, it turned out, had quit his father's firm 6 months prior. He was taking classes in landscape architecture, a passion he'd long suppressed. He spoke about it with a quiet, nervous excitement that I recognized, and I offered him a genuine smile of encouragement. The most profound moment came after the meal. Uncle Robert found me in the living room where I was stoking the fire in the great stone hearth. He stood beside me, looking at the flames. "You know," he said, his voice softer than it ever been. "This house, the foundation, what you've done for this town, it's a legacy, a real legacy, the kind that lasts." He paused, swirling the wind in his glass. "I spent my whole life building that, but you built life." He looked at me then, his eyes clear and direct. "I was a fool, and I am sorry." The words hung in the warm air between us. An apology, finally, and I found that all I felt was a gentle sense of closure, like the soft click of a book being closed at the end of a long and satisfying story. "Thank you, Uncle Robert," I said. "That means a lot." Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and the house had fallen silent, I walked the short path through the woods back to my cottage. This tiny stone building, once my only fortress, was now my sanctuary. The world I had built outside, the campus, the global brand, the foundation, was wonderful, but this was the heart. I stepped into my old workshop. The air smelled of beeswax and drying herbs, the scent of my own beginnings. I wasn't there to work on a new product line or fulfill an order. I was there simply for the joy of it. I lit a small, hand-dipped taper candle, unscented, imperfect, and for my eyes only. The single flame flickered to life, pushing back the darkness. It illuminated my face, and in its reflection in the dark window pane, I saw not a CEO or a multimillionaire, but simply a woman who was content. A woman who had been mocked for her cottage business and had responded not with words, but by building a world. The silence I had once worn as armor was now a comfortable cloak of peace. The world could have its roaring success. I was happy here, in the quiet, in the flickering light, in the small, magical space where a woman, a dream, and a handful of herbs had been more than enough all along.